Where I grew up, a big breakfast like this has always been a treat. And to me, it's an even bigger treat when I can have this breakfast in a hotel room. And hotel breakfasts have got a lot to teach us. On the one hand, it is a luxury. I worked late last night, I get up early in the morning, I've got to get back to the conference, so I rush down to the breakfast room, get in the queue, wait till I get to the front, and I get exactly what I want. Except sometimes, when you do get to the front of the queue, they've run out of eggs, or they've run out of bacon, or croissants, or whatever, and it tends to spoil my entire day because I was actually looking forward to that croissant. Now, I'm sure it's happened to a lot of you, but the question in my mind is always, who do I blame? Is it the hotel? Did they not budget enough? Were there not enough eggs? Was there some other reason why we ran out of bacon? Or was it perhaps the guy in front of the queue, ahead of me? Why did he take 3 eggs and not just 2 eggs? Didn't he know that I also had to get my 2 eggs and that I was looking forward to it? It sounds rather silly, but let's transpose this example to water and water usage. We live in a water-scarce country, and there are a lot of people around who need water for whatever they do, apart from the fact that we all need water just to live. Now, forestry plant their trees in the catchment areas. In other words, they are right in front of the breakfast queue. And the question is, are they aware of the people behind them in the queue? Or perhaps they are not to blame if I don't get water on my farm. Perhaps it's the people who decided how many eggs each customer can get.
The truth is that plantations do use water. The question is how much water and what is acceptable. Forestry uses about 3% of the water. 3% of the available water, I think it's up to 6 or 8% of the stored water.
People on both sides of the debate like to make comparisons between forestry and other sectors. But this is to some extent a futile conversation. Of course we need water, and of course agriculture provides food. But of course we also need industry and export products to earn money to pay for our ever-increasing population's needs. And to make it even more complicated, different people will give different figures as to how thirsty a tree is.
To measure that is extremely difficult, and there are different ways that it's been measured. In the early days, they measured it by having paired catchments. So you plant one catchment up to trees, and you have a catchment next door that you don't plant. You build a weir at the bottom of the catchment, and then you measure the water coming off.
Even though this method produced reasonable results, it was not necessarily the best approach, as you can never really get equal catchments. There will always be differences in landscape, depth of soil, or the amount of water used. And also, you can't just extrapolate the usage in one area to another. Trees growing where there is more water will also use more water than the same species growing somewhere less wet. But it is also important to know how much water the plantations need, to be able to plan how many plantations we can allow, and to make sure downstream users' needs are also fulfilled. And over time, more ways of measuring water usage have been developed.
The other approach is to try and measure the water coming off a plantation, either by measuring how much water is going up a tree, and so they use a method called the heat pulse method. They have instrumentation that you put a probe into the bark of the tree, 2 probes, and you inject a bit of heat into the bottom one, and then measure how quickly the heat gets to the top one, and through that you can measure how fast the water is moving up, and they work out the volume of water.
They can also measure the water vapor coming off the canopy of a plantation in order to get an idea of the water usage of the trees. The actual figures may differ, but the different calculation methods all agree on one point, that a plantation uses more water than the original natural vegetation would. The thing about water is that there's no extra water to go around. Sappi is limited to the amount allocated to them on their water permit, and that makes it very difficult to grow the business, as they can't really plant more trees. Except, of course, if they plant more trees that are less thirsty than the ones standing there now. And all this must be taken into account when they decide which species or even which subspecies they want to plant.
The range between measuring different pines in different places is big as the range between measuring pines and gums. So if you look at it, gums use more water, but statistically you cannot calculate and say directly that gums use a hang of a lot more water.
Whatever the specific figures, the fact remains that plantations use water and can significantly reduce stream flow, especially in times of drought or reduced rainfall. But one must also keep in mind that this water is not wasted and is often used a lot more productively than in some other practices.
Timber production is quite efficient. We get quite a lot of return for the water we use. So for every litre of water we use, we earn very good money, and more money than most of the agricultural crops. In fact, a lot more money. I think trouble is when you do these calculations, it depends on the cost of timber or the value in the product you're selling. But plantation forestry is an efficient user of water. The trees we use give good growth for the amount of water we use.
In the end, even the critics have to accept that we need a healthy economy and that our economy needs forestry. The only justified criticism would be if they waste water, or if government miscalculated the amount of water they make available to this sector.
Our responsibility is that we've been given a water use license. The authorities, when we got permission to plant trees, calculated how much water we can use in that catchment. We carry out good practice within our plantations. In other words, we make sure we don't plant the trees in wet areas where water is stored in the landscape, like in wetlands and riparian zones. And so I believe we use water legitimately in the landscape if we've done everything correctly and according to the law and responsibly.
It must be one of my favorite sights. Water coming down the mountain after a few days of good rain. Now, you don't need to be a genius to know that we all need water to live. You also don't need to be a genius to know that we need to grow our economy. We need industries like Sappi if we want to supply the lifestyle, the quality of life that we all need in this country. You also need to know that just because somebody is ahead of you in the queue when it comes to water does not automatically mean that they are to blame for your water woes. Before you decide if someone is guilty or innocent, you need to look at only 3 criteria. In the first place, are they staying within the parameters of the water that's been worked out, calculated and allocated to them? In the second place, what do they do with the water that they do use? Are they managing it properly or are they wasting it? And in the third place, what is the quality of the water leaving their land? What do they pass on to those behind them in the queue? If they pass all 3 of these tests, then obviously they're innocent. If not, then we need to point our fingers and they need to clean up their act.